I was really looking forward to coming here. And when people said, well, why are you going to Indiana? I said, I'm going to learn. And I've only been here about 24 hours, and I've already learned a lot. So it's absolutely fulfilling my expectations about being here. So I come to you from a place where the earth is pink and where the sky rises up like a cathedral of blue and where the river weaves through the village like a string of sheep's wool. And I come to you from a place where the men's jeans are threadbare from seasons of mending fences and where the women know the plants. And I come to you from a place where the language is Spanish, but not quite, because it's peppered with a history of Aztec and Tewa and Navajo, and it's blended together like green chili stew, which is what we eat. I live in Chimayo, and the previous name for the place was Si Mayo. It's a native term. But nobody at this point can remember if that means black obsidian flakes or if it means the place where two rivers meet. So the Santa Cruz River winds down, snakes down from the Sangre de Cristo, and it flows through the village and then spreads out into smaller waterways that we call acequias. They are the irrigation ditches that people dig that require nothing more than a shovel and the gravity for them to feed water to the houses. That was before there was running water, and also to feed water to the fields. It's a desert upland. It's 6,200 feet above sea level, and it's surrounded by badlands, where there are the cerros, or the hills, and the barrancas, or these kind of peaks of pink sand that were created when there was an ocean there. And in the midst of this desert lies Cimayo, which is an oasis of cottonwoods and pinon and olive and chili and corn and tomatoes and apples. And we still have a system of barter that's still in existence from how it was 200 years ago. Each village has its own specialty. So the village of Velarde is known for its apples, and El Valle is known for its sheep, and Chimayo is known for chile, and San Luis, which is up in southern, how we pronounce it is Colorado, is known for potatoes. And the people of the village are a beautiful mix of European, of Spanish, Moor, and Jewish, of Mexican, Aztec, Mayan, Toltec, and of the local natives, Tewa and Navajo and Apache, who were the nomadic tribes. And then to add another cultural layer, in the Pachuco language, which is the renegade Chicano culture, urban culture of the 40s and 50s, the village is called Chima. So Chima is where I live, and Chima is indistinguishable from who I am. But there's also something else that's indistinguishable from who I am, and that's where I come from. So my people are originally from what are now some of the main countries of Northern Europe. Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, France, Belgium, and Germany, and Holland. And my first ancestors came over to Turtle Island in 1633. And one of them was a man named Thomas Hooker, who was a preacher. And he had a fight with the governor, Bradford, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony about democracy, about who could vote. And he was slightly more liberal, and not entirely liberal. But he didn't remember that there were women. But he thought that that all men should be able to vote, whereas Bradford thought that only landowning men should vote. I mean, landowning, they'd only been there a few years. I don't know how they figured out how some people owned and some people didn't, but they did. So they took off and left and went down to what's now Hartford and established the colony of Connecticut, which later became the state of Connecticut. And then Connecticut, if you go directly west from Connecticut to Ohio, is what they claimed as the Western Reserve of Connecticut. And that's where my family, I'm fourth or fifth generation, I haven't quite figured it out, fourth or fifth generation Ohio from the Western Reserve. So that's also who I am. I am these two things that I'm talking about. And what I'm presenting is a bottom line of human identity. It's not what, in this society, what kind of car you drive. It's not what kind of tag is on your shirt or what kind of job or who you married or what kind of shoes you're wearing. It's first and foremost where you are from and what land you're made out of. And in Chimayo or in the villages of northern New Mexico, the first question that anybody asks you about yourself is, what village are you from? And when I say Chimayo as my answer, everyone laughs uproariously and calls me a Chimayosa. It's a great joke. And the second is, what is your responsibility for the land? And in northern New Mexico, that is answered by what family you're from, because then it's known, you know, what the responsibility of that family is the Martinez family or the Vigil family in that area. Someone else who has spoken about this is Jeanette Armstrong, and she's an Okanagan woman who's an elder and has studied the medicine ways of her people, and this is the way she puts it. The way we talk about ourselves as Okanagan people is difficult to replicate in English. Our word for human beings is difficult to say without talking about connection to the land. My mother is a river Indian. She is Kettle Falls, which is the main confluence of the Columbia River. The Kettle River people are in charge of the fisheries in all of the northern parts of the Columbia River system in our territories. My great-grandfather was a salmon chief and caretaker of the river in the north. My father's people are mountain people. They occupy what's called the northern part of the Okanagan proper, around the part of British Columbia that is known as the Okanagan Valley. My father's people were hunters. Their medicine comes from that spirit. We say, this is my clan, or this is my people. In this way, you know my position, what my place is, what my responsibility for that geography is. This is how I introduce myself. And then she said, tell me who you really are. And so I want to put forth a question to this group, and if there might be a few volunteers who could come up and in just, say, 2 minutes or so, tell us who you are, introduce yourselves. As Jeanette then went on to say, I don't care what organizations you belong to or how many books you've written or what job you have, tell me who you really are. Come on.
My knees are weak. I'm an alien. I feel it all the time. I have no place. And when I say what I believe, I look in people's eyes and they don't know, I feel, what I'm saying. I am a person without a place. There are little places that I love, that I go back to in my memory. But I can't say that I'm a person from Indianapolis or my block. It doesn't mean anything. And I am deeply grieved because I know most of us are aliens. I'm nobody. Who are you?
Hi, my name's Stephanie Blake, and I'm a mom, which really grounds me real good because I have to take care of another person, so I know my place there. I'm a mom, and I grew up in northern Indiana running around all the time. I love to be outside, and so that's part of me, and I feel responsible to keep things healthy. And I am part of a community, luckily, a school that my daughter goes to, Harmony, and I feel really a part there. I feel responsible for not my kid, but the other kids, and the school, and the teachers, and our community. And I'm a part of Bloomington, and I feel a big part of that, and I feel like I don't want I-69 to come through. And, I'm adopted, and I really wish I knew my biological mother because I grew up in a family that was very different from me, and I would love to be able to see my mother's face and see who I am. And so I would love to know my roots, like if I'm a German or what the heck, and where I came from, but that's me. Thanks.
My name is Jenny, and I think it wasn't until just a few years ago that I really even thought about really the bigger picture. Growing up in a family with not a lot of money and folks with not a lot of education, but really big hearts, and every day was, what are we gonna eat? How are we gonna get to school? And it was very inward. And then I got the opportunity to go to college at IU and met a wonderful family that had the opportunity to get well educated, and found myself suddenly awakening to understanding that there's more than just macaroni and cheese and ramen noodle soup. There's people suffering, and there's and sometimes it feels like there's nothing you can do, but then stepping back and saying, well, there is, and seeing my students talking about Afghanistan, we should just nuke them. Then saying, but wait, if we change just a little bit in our lives, just a little bit where maybe we can stop killing animals for food. We can rely on food from around our towns. We can ride our bikes instead of riding in a car. We can love each other instead of saying, let's nuke them. We can be forgiving and gentle instead of jealous. So much jealousy when we're insecure. And all we have to do is trust and be gentle with ourselves and with each other. And that's what I'm learning about myself.
I'm Steve Kennard, and I live in Columbus, but I'm part of this universe because I am made out of the same stuff you are, which is star stuff. And that takes us all together, and we're part of this planet because we're all made out of minerals. We're walking minerals, and we're all part of that. And we're connected to the biosphere around us, and I'm part of that, and you're a part of that, and I think that's what we're really missing at this point, this connectedness to the whole universe that we're all part of. Once we see that, then we find our connections to Earth and to economic systems. Thinking on that.
Great. Woman in the purple. Okay, we're going to have one more. And it's you in the lavender. Oh, Betty.
That I will add something to it. I was touched by the gentleman that said he felt like an alien because he didn't belong anywhere. And I'm an alien in this country. And for some time, I really missed my home and I felt like an alien. I didn't feel like I quite belonged. But then Chellis also said, well, who are you really? And I was just thinking, well, who I really am is the little girl that would go with her parents to the woods, and then I would go for a walk, and I would just stand by a tree by myself early in the morning, and I'd touch these trees, and I'd, wow, oh man, oh wow. And then I'm over here, and I'm from Holland, and it's small, and there are not that many trees. I had to go all the way to the east side of the country to find some trees. The rest is, it's pretty full there. So now I'm in this country where there are trees. And there are these places where I can find that are wild. And I still am that same little girl that go like, wow, all right, I guess I feel at home. And I'm also willing, we got to defend them. We don't want to go like my country that cut all the trees out, and there's not much left, so we got to do something. So I'm not quite so alien because I'm still there and I'm still surrounded by trees and the beautiful world, and that's just fine.
Well, thank you. I know everybody in here has a story. So the title of this presentation is Living in Intimacy with the Earth. But the language is kind of curious because it implies a separation by the very language. And I don't think that that's the fault of people who made up the title. I think it's the fault of the English language. Because there's a subject and there's a verb and then there's an object. So there's objectification that's going on. I know in native languages that the languages itself are speaking about the interconnections and the oneness of it all. So it seems that in the English language, since this is what we're using, that we have to use poetry to overcome the problem. So I'm going to retitle the presentation right now, and I'm going to use the words of Susan Griffin, the feminist philosopher and poet. Made of this earth. Made of this earth is the title of this presentation. And so what does that mean? Well, obviously it means that we take the earth in. We eat the earth, we breathe the earth, and then we give back to the earth. We excrete into the earth, and then finally when we die, we give our bodies back to the earth. As Wendell Berry says, we pass through the landscape and the landscape passes through us. Another thing that's been written about this is written by the historian Calvin Martin, who wrote In the Spirit of the Earth. And he writes, he's talking about hunting, but I guess you could submit or substitute the word carrot for moose if you want to. To eat for survival becomes a transformation rather than a murder. Certifying it as a transformation is the fact that it is eaten. In this manner, moose becomes me, and I become moose. The meal is sacred. It is the bringing forth of new life, that of the communicant becoming now in the process part of the creature consumed. It is rather like the transformation that occurs during the masked dance. The adorned dancer has actually become the creature that is being depicted in mime and likeness. The dancer is transformed, translated, because this is the law of the earth. So we might ask, if humans are made out of the earth, then what is culture? It seems to be a construct that seems in some ways separate. At least that's certainly our experience in mass technological society. And to this I turn to my friend Larry Emerson, who's a Navajo man who was educated in dominant society economics, but then after that returned to his tribe and his people, and for the last 10 years has been studying to become a medicine man. And he says that true culture is not something that you think up rationally, like well, what are we going to put in the malls now? that true culture literally comes in a relationship with the landscape and literally comes as a message from the landscape. So an example of that is that he and I met to figure out a place where we were going to have a meeting of a group of Native people and a group of people from an institute that at that time was called the Elmwood Institute, who were all European or European Americans, and that we were going to explore the similarities in our worldviews because we were all kind of renegade intellectuals. And so I showed him the area in northern New Mexico near where I was living, where we would camp and where I thought we would eat and sleep and all these things. And so then he had determined which one was what he called the grandmother tree. And then he went into a trance and he communed with the grandmother tree to find out if it was okay. See, he viewed this as culture creation. I mean, I was just viewing it as a meeting. And he saw it as the beginning of something that was, suitably under the rubric of culture. And so he asked the grandmother tree if it was okay, if this was the suitable place, and could we meet there? And the tree said yes. So I was witness to an act of cultural creation. My friend Stan Lucero from Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico showed me something else. And he had been elected to be on the council. They have 6 villages, 6 or 7 villages at Laguna Pueblo, and each one has a representative to the council. So he'd been elected, but when he went to the meetings, he never talked because his was the last village that did it in the old way. And that was that they took the problem back. Should we have a casino? Should we build a new church? How are we going to deal with hunger among the children? He would take it back, whatever the question was, and he would speak to the elders and tell them what it was, and they would go into trance and speak to the spirit world and come back and tell him how to vote. His was the only village that held out against the casino, curiously. So Larry then went on to talk about what is it like to travel? What happens when you move into the space of another people? And he says that when he leaves the Dene or the Navajo territory, that he stops at the boundary and goes into prayer and asks for the benefit and the good, all goodness to come to the people and the land that he is entering. So he's a true spiritual traveler into a different place. It's so different, than like flying over the United States and, just kind of looking at the little things down there and feeling perhaps nothing about it. It's so far away. And that brings me to the whole sense of being out of place that I want to speak of. And I think that this is something different than what some of the people spoke about here tonight. I went to a meeting in Salzburg, Austria, that was a gathering of indigenous people a number of years ago. And there was a man named Rex Toulouse who was from the Havasupai, and their place is the Grand Canyon. And he spoke on some panels, but I never saw him at meals or at any of the gatherings. And I asked, well, where is he? And they said that he was feeling so out of place and so disconnected that he spent all the time mourning for his land in his hotel room. And that really struck me. I thought, my goodness, if I could feel for my homeland so profoundly that I couldn't even come out, I mean, what that must be like. And that was, it was kind of like a slap in the face and cold water and just really to think about what that is. So I tell these stories, and they're amazing to us. They're a surprise to us in a way because, as we've said, it's not our reality. We have become wrenched from place by history. And so we suffer a terrible disjunction in ourselves. And for instance, the food comes from elsewhere. Plants come from elsewhere. What's your Indiana state flower? The peony? Is that what I learned? Where's that from? Is that from Indiana? Land comes from elsewhere. You can go to Walmart and buy peat moss from Canada. The animals come from elsewhere. One of the big revelations to me when I was writing Off the Map was with this person, Snowflake Martinez, who I was sharing with him Winnie the Pooh, and was sharing with him the chapter about the dreaming of the heffalumps. And he took this in and thought it was pretty marvelous. And then at the end he was thinking, and he said, oh, wait a minute, no hay elefantes in England. You know, there's no elephants in England. 100 Acre Wood is in England. This is taking place, you know. And it was like, I mean, I just assumed that all animals were everywhere. You know, that was my upbringing in the empire. So that was a revelation. And so we ourselves are from elsewhere. I mean, that's one thing that we just had revealed. I speak of this wrenching that we have experienced through history as trauma. And the definition in the psychology field of trauma is an event that is outside the range of usual human experience and that would be markedly distressing to almost anyone. Well, we have a lot of traumas in our lives. You know, certainly we've all been infused with the trauma of the last year and the last few days, September 11th. And we're living with the prospect of trauma, the prospect of a war that could involve mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction. And yet the past wars are still reverberating within us. Desert Storm, Vietnam, Korea, World War II, millions of people killed, millions. The beginning of the atomic age happened during World War II, and World War I is still reverberating. And then within our society, there's rape. 1 in 3 women is raped, girls are raped before the age of 18, often by someone within the family. 1 in 4 women are raped in their lives in the adult world. 1 in 6 boys is raped before reaching the age of 18, usually by someone in the family. And every 3 seconds in the United States, someone is raped. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. I wonder if we can take a moment and have everyone in the room who has either experienced rape or been affected by the rape of someone else to stand up. Thank you. And it goes back, you know, it goes back. Like I think a lot about the witch hunts and the power and of that event in both Europe and the United States. So we learn that we are absolutely infused with trauma. And to me, the original trauma, the one that lies beneath these and behind them, is this wrenching from earth and place that took place a while back. And so I want to spend a few moments speaking about our history. One of the things I talk about in the book, My Name is Chellis, is a timeline that's 100 feet long. And I make that 100 feet long be 1 million years. Now, there's a lot of dispute about how long we've been human. Some people say 3 million years, and some people say 100,000. And so I kind of picked a number in the middle. It tells the story. So if 100 feet is, a basketball court is just about 100 feet. And 99 feet of the 100 feet, so coming right up to underneath one basket at one side, human beings lived in unmediated participation with the natural world. So we were made of that ellipsis. We were made of that sustainability. We knew nothing else. That's who we are. The last 12 inches began the domestication of the Neolith, and that was 40,000 years ago. But to put it in a way that you can understand, like, you know, at any given time you might know 3 or 4 generations. The Neolith happened only 300 generations ago. So that's pretty amazing. It's not, it seems like it's really a long time ago. The last fifth of an inch of the basketball court is since the Industrial Revolution and since the beginning of mass technological civilization. That's about 200 years, which is only like 6 or 7 generations. So it's like you almost know all the people going back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So this tells us that who we are creatures who evolved to be made of the earth, and moose becomes me and I become moose. And the separation that is so much a part of our lives is indeed outside the range of human experience and indeed is markedly distressing. So it is a trauma. Speaking just about agriculture, anthropologists Lionel Tiger and Robin Fox call agriculture the great leap backward. Paul Shepard calls it regression. And the physiologist Jared Diamond calls it the worst mistake in the history of the human race. I call it original trauma. And one of its primary results is the loss of freedom that people had when they lived in unmediated participation with the natural world. And the way that historian Andrew Schmuckler puts that is saddle, yoke, man becomes a beast of burden. So in other words, something went wrong and we got really screwed up. Jeff already referred to this, but I'll just kind of lay it out again. Before I get to the social and psychological implications of this screw up, I want to lay out that this view is a direct challenge to the notion of progress that is so important in this society, which is it's a construct that humans are evolving, ever evolving in social organization, in technological development, and even in psychological integration. And it's a construct that sees the current problems like global warming or ozone depletion or toxic contamination or racial violence or biotech or electromagnetic pollution as the mere throes of a kind of a pesky adolescence like pimples or something. So I have a lot of colleagues, and I imagine a lot of people in this room, who join me in this challenge to the notion of progress. Certainly Native people do, because it says that they're primitive, whereas I view Native people or Native culture as more advanced, actually, more integrated, shall I say. My friend John Zerzan believes that the problem was way back in the Paleolith, when division of labor took place and different people took on certain specialties way back then. In a simple way, it would look like nothing to us, but it was something that happened. And my friend Kirkpatrick Sale is writing a book right now. He also goes back to the Paleolith, and he identifies the problem at the point where people stopped scavenging to eat, and he's talking about meat, and began hunting. So that was a big change. And he said the psychological implications of that were that humans began to objectify. So he's taking it way back then. I focus on the unfoldings of the Neolith. I'm not saying this is where it started. I don't really know. I mean, I'm interested in the theories of Zerzan and Sale and other people. But for our purposes, let's look at something really major happened with the domestication of the Neolith. And that was 40,000 years ago, 300 generations. When certain people began to, not everybody did it, it's not a linear trajectory, began to domesticate plants, it behooved them to become sedentary. And so instead of moving around quite so much, it was the first time that people built permanent storage for food and permanent housing and accumulated more possessions than they could carry on their backs. And this change sowed not only the seeds of grain, but also seeds of private property and seeds of class. So this is what Margaret Ehrenberg, a British anthropologist, says about this. She says, a distinction between rich and poor, which is insignificant in forager societies, develops progressively as wealth is passed from generation to generation within families, while others are never able to achieve surpluses. The wealthy become powerful by lending to poorer families in return for services such as farm labor or support in combat against other groups. By this means, the rich are able to become more wealthy, while the poor become indebted and have to produce more and more, or spend time on tasks other than directly for their own subsistence. And so the vicious circle begins. So the population explosion began with all of this. There's evidence from archaeology in the Near East that within a generation or two that the population expanded by 700% from how it had been when the people were not sedentary. So you know how women athletes sometimes don't have their periods for a long period because they're so active? Well, that's how it was for a woman who was a gatherer. She was very athletic. She's always moving, always walking, carrying the baby on the hip. And the women were, in many parts of the world, lean with little body fat, and therefore little estrogen, and therefore rarely ovulating. And also breastfeeding for long periods of time, which was a practice of humans, also contributed to infrequent ovulation. And then when sedentary farming began, women no longer carried their babies because they were doing tedious, kind of mechanistic sort of work. And so they put the babies down in pens. And they stopped the lengthy breastfeeding. It wasn't convenient anymore. And so postpartum ovulation occurred sooner. And the diet also contributed because it was more grains now, not so much protein, more carbohydrates, more storage of fat, more estrogen, and so more regular ovulations. And so was born the large farm family. So I also want to back up a little bit here and talk about how there were psychological impacts, because before a child was held by somebody all the time. So that first need to become, to experience acceptance and belonging and safety in this world outside the womb was answered. And then the child would kick off when it was ready to try something out different. And in this case, the child is just put in a pen. And so that separation between child and mother or any other human being had really strong psychological impacts that we're all still really dealing with. So there were more babies, and there were more people. And so there was more work to do, more food to raise, and so began the rat race. And with more people, there was a need to expand the fields. And so suddenly there was something that cropped up, which was wars of expansion. Wars with other people who were hoping to get the same. And there was a loss of that simple give and take of sustainability. And so people began what they call agricultural intensification. Having to do it on, even though the population is expanding, having to do it on just this set piece of land. And so they built terraces and hauled water and fertilized and domesticated more plants, et cetera, et cetera. And then there was what came up was a need to quantify and to standardize things. And so, to standardize how many people there were, or how many conquered people they'd gotten, and where they were, and how many crops, and was that going to last through the winter, and all of that. And, we can look back at the abacus as one of the early counters or computers. So we begin to see in the Neolith the roots of transition from the wholeness of a nature-based elliptical way of being into the kind of mechanization of technological society. And so I do want to say a few things about technology, because what happened to our relationship to tools is absolutely of interest to us. It's essential that we understand, because we're now living in a society that is completely defined and dominated by technologies. So new technologies were needed constantly to solve the problems of this unending spiral of settlement, the increasing complexity of things, and the speeding up of life. And so was born the technological fix. A plow to farm the expanding croplands, whereas before people had done it with just a stick. Grain stores to store excess food. Wooden vessels to store in the house. Aqueducts to transport water. And even people became technology. And so a system was born where people had narrow functions. For instance, you needed owners to amass the capital. This is a really interesting, different way to look at it from a kind of a systems approach rather than just being, angry at the people who do this, and yet it goes on and on and on. If you look at the system, that if you're building a system that's getting bigger and more complex, that you need somebody at a certain level to be amassing what's required to make that happen, to make it work. Managers to oversee it all. Slaves to do the work. Priests and priestesses to curb the encroaching alienation. So this is like really division of labor here. So each change that came fostered the need for some personal adjustment, some social reaction, or some technological invention that would ease the impact or solve the problems of the last. And so if you kind of can grasp this, you can see the Neolith evolving into the Industrial Revolution and then becoming economic globalization. It's not a mystery. It's like a snowball rolling down a hill, ever expanding, ever speeding up, increasingly unsustainable. Class system, overpopulation, the need for birth control intervention, until we have today's world where every inch of livable place on this earth is taken. And so, of course, we have borders clashing. Borders between neighbors, borders between people, borders between what are now nation states. And so with it all comes this need that I referred to before briefly, but I'd like to go into it more, the need for psychological intervention. What I'm describing is the creation of a system that's based on fear, because you have this feeling that you're not going to have enough provided. Whereas before, people moved through the world, certainly it didn't always work out, but moving through the world as if the earth was going to constantly be providing. And so people's basic stance, the gratitude that many Native people have in their philosophies doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from experience, the experience that the earth does provide. And so what is replacing that is a deity, a single monolithic deity of judgment and discipline. You've got to keep working, you've got to do this, and this is bad, and this is, et cetera, et cetera. So we have many of our modern religions. And as a psychologist, I look at this and I can see post-traumatic stress disorder. I can see it I'm not just talking about individuals, I'm talking about the entire society, that it has post-traumatic stress disorder. That's its diagnosis, among other things. So you have fear. And what happens when fear is greater than a system can handle is that a person's psyche dissociates, it splits. And maybe part of it goes over here and kind of can describe what happened, but maybe other parts go over here and get repressed. Like maybe a person remembers what happened, but over here, they don't have any feelings about it. Oh yeah, I was in a plane wreck, and then there's no feelings. Or they might have feelings about it, or symptoms, medical symptoms that express it. Maybe someone who was raped has pelvic inflammatory disease, but they don't remember it. So that's kind of how that happens, how that dissociation happens. And then when you have dissociation, you have a lot of different symptoms. And so let's look at these symptoms from the perspective of this society that we're living in. Like hyperreactivity, is anybody noticing any hyperreactivity in our society? Flashbacks, recurrent intrusive recollections. So I look to the movies for this. Do we need another horror film? Do we need another violent film about, terrorists or buildings or fires or volcanoes or wars or apparently, it's like flashbacks. It just keeps rolling, the same theme. Psychic numbing. It's a big one in our society. It's like no memory of anything that happened before. Despite all this, we shall never forget. that's kind of selective. A sense of powerlessness. You know, when you're dissociated from your full experience, you're dissociated from your full skills and your full capacities, your resources. And so there's a kind of a desperation and a sense of powerlessness that is really profound in this society. It's a disconnect from what should be the power of feeling at one. And so there's that need for the rescuer. You know, Superman. Arrested Development. Has anybody noticed maybe some of our leaders who seem a little younger than they might be? Narcissism. You know, so much emphasis on the individual that is unheard of in human history, just absolutely unheard of. I remember when I first moved to New Mexico from San Francisco almost 20 years ago, and I was speaking to a Native man, and I said, you know, a lot of people I know, we always talk about our feelings. Oh, well, I experienced this. Well, then I went to the store, and then I saw this, and then, oh, and then my brother called, and I felt this, and you know, and I said, this is before I was working with Native people, or living in a village that was Native, Chicano Native, but Native nonetheless. And he just laughed at me. He just laughed uproariously, and I guess the answer was no. But if we look at that in terms of our society, you know, it reflects, the personal and the political reflect each other. If we look at that in terms of our society, you know, look at Hollywood. I mean, look at celebrity. You know, it really is a bizarre thing. And another thing that I want to say is that there's an odd way in which some things that are archetypal become trumped up in this post-traumatic stress disorder suffering society. And so then they have even more of a hold on it. Because everybody should have their work acknowledged, you know, and everybody should be encouraged to do their best. But, you know, to pick out, I mean, I actually, during the Gulf War, I actually called up ABC and told them I thought they should let Peter Jennings have a nap. You know, I mean, he was going like 24 hours a day, you know, and it was like, no, I mean, that was like against their concept of that one person, that we needed to have this one person in charge. She kind of treated me like I was a puppy dog, you know, just, and she's like, what? You know, and then she was kind of like, oh, well, oh, yes, right, you know, like I was. Anyway, addictions come out of this dissociation. They come out of that fear that's so great that it leads to dissociation. And then the nature of an addiction is that it's trying to fill a need that is by now, because of the psychic numbing and the denial, is forgotten. And the need is that we live in community in sustainable relationship with the earth. Well, that's not, nobody remembers that. And so you have to keep going back to whatever it is, whether it's sex or alcohol or marijuana or heroin or shopping or cars or speed or work or, you know, whatever it is. And it kind of answers it, but it doesn't completely answer it, and that's why you have to keep going back. So when we look at this, a very common response that we have, of course, is that we feel despair. We feel out of sorts. We get depressed. You know, we feel like, well, there's no hope. And I do want to honor those feelings. It's important. It's not a good thing to spend your whole life in them, but it's important to see what the lesson in that is, because often the lesson is that we are connected. But I want to pass on a slightly different piece of wisdom tonight. And it's something that I hope that we can use right now and that we can remember always in the struggles that come in the future to us, and there will be struggles in the future. And that is that we are people who are made of this earth. We are people made of this earth. The traditional elders and youth of the Onondaga Nation put it this way: Mother Earth is where you are. She hasn't gone anywhere. You can find her in an elevator. And we invoke this memory, this knowledge, this awareness, just by talking about it. We are people made of this earth. Just look around this room, look at this community. We are made of the earth. And what Calvin Martin says is, we never left our true, real context. We left that context only in our fevered imagination. It all began as an active imagination, an illusory image, most fundamentally an image of fear. And so the corrective process must likewise begin with an image. Let us relearn what forager-gatherers knew to the core of their being. In other words, let's reclaim the knowing of who we are and what our origins are. And despite the arrangement of our lives today, in the midst of technologies and the global economic systems and the post-traumatic stress being acted out all around us, and sometimes through us, you and I are fused with the earth, and that's the way it is. That's the reality, that's the truth. And we can spend our lives longing for what once was, or angry, or bitter, or lost. It's possible to do that. But what I'm proposing is that if that's an overwhelming feeling that we have, that's part of the process. It's not a stopping place. That if you really fully give yourself to that, you come out the other end of it. And what we come to is the realization that what we do today is real, it's archetypal, and it's historic, and it's essentially human. So this gathering at the Arts Center, this is archetypal. Our ancestors, 500, 700 generations ago, they gathered. They gathered together and they did different things. Sometimes they gathered to support something, or sometimes they gathered to listen to someone talk, and sometimes they gathered to talk to each other, and sometimes to dance, and sometimes to have ceremony. This is one of the things that people do. And this festival that's happening this weekend, the fair, this is what humans were meant to do, to come together and to share this. So all the activities that have been engaged in to create this fair this weekend, the growing, the harvesting, the eating, the hammering, the gluing, the drawing, the talking, the meeting, all the things that have taken place, the walking, the relationships that have been nurtured in putting this together, leading up to it, and then ultimately being a part of it when it happens. These are ultimately human experiences. And it's good for us to remember this and to feel this in our blood. I experienced, or I tried to approach, coming here, coming across Turtle Island to this place as a journey of great importance, as a sacred journey, to come to be with you and to learn from you and to be part of something essentially archetypal that you are doing. And so what I want to bring to you tonight is a certain kind of news, and that is that as I look around, and maybe you know this, but it's good to have somebody say, it's good to have somebody come in from somewhere else and say it, but there's a new seriousness afoot, a new seriousness about really truly knowing who we are and embarking upon the incredible challenge that stands before us with that knowledge, and that is to reclaim our place on the earth, which is a sacred place of connection. So we have, to my mind, 3 mammoth tasks ahead of us. And one of them comes right out of trauma recovery, and it is remembrance and reconnection. So if you want to recover from a trauma, it's really important that you remember all of it. And sometimes that comes in small pieces over a long period of time. But you have to bring all the disparate parts together so you have all of your resources. And the way that Judith Herman talks about this, she's a psychologist from the East Coast, in her book Trauma and Recovery, she says, reconnect the fragments, reconstruct the history, and make meaning. So I hope that I was touching on that process tonight by going back so far in our history. Because as we know, mass technological society is this amazingly complex reflection of post-traumatic stress disorder, and we have to bring what it has wrenched apart back together again. So we have to bring our personal stories back together with our collective stories. And we have to bring our spirituality back with our standing up for what's right for humans, in other words, our politics. And we have to bring our knowledge of where food comes from and how to produce it and how to receive it and how to prepare it and how to make it and eat it back with our politics. And men who became wrenched from women in this process, women from men, to come back together again. And our hearts back together with our mental understanding of what's going on. And our courage reconnected to meaningful action. So I'd like to lay open the microphone again and see what other things you think of that need to be brought back together again. Maybe calling out is a better way. The young with the old. Actions and their consequences. Yes, wow. Our hearts and our bodies. We have to take back our politics. Death with life. Pardon? Knowledge and wisdom.
If you'll excuse the paradox, we also have to reconnect with the dissociated world around us.
Mm. Reconnecting with the dissociated world around us.
We have to learn to be happy with ourselves, to live in the now, and then be happy with everybody else.
Mm.
Sharing, accommodating.
Happy with ourselves, living in the now in order to be happy with others in community.
Labor and enjoyment.
Labor and enjoyment. Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. So he's talking about being in the now and understanding things as they come and not always looking to the past, making a decision about whether to look to the past about how to deal with something today, right? Yes, if it applies. Breath and hear. Okay. Oh. Yeah, mothers and children. Yes.
Consumption patterns and ecological limits.
And ecological what?
Limits.
Limits, yes. Okay. Ecological limits and consumption patterns. Medicine and nature. Families. Local and global. Well, we could We could go on for a while. But yeah. Action and belief and feeling. Okay.
How medicine is practiced now and how when it was practiced 200 years ago is considered alternative today.
Yeah. Medicine again. Okay. Wow. So the second mammoth task that we have, that's a big one, has to do with our fierceness, our ferocity, and it comes under the rubric of resistance. And so I like to quote Che Guevara here. Déjame decirle a riesgo de parecer ridículo que el revolucionario verdadero está guiado por grandes sentimientos de amor. Let me tell you, at the risk of appearing ridiculous, that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. Highway 69. Love of Bloomington. Let me tell you a couple of stories from where I am that I think are really fantastic. This happened before I moved to Chimayo. And this unsuspecting multinational bank decided that Chimayo was the appropriate location for an ATM machine. So they took the barn that used to be, that well still is, but it's a different kind of building now, but the old barn next to the apple shed and installed this thing. And the villagers kind of checked it out for a while and, you know, got the gist of what it was. And one night the men went and they took their hunting rifles and shot the shit out of the ATM machine. Another one is that there was this Canadian multinational that came in, and by US law, as well as the mining law of the state of New Mexico, they had all their papers in order to be able to dig that copper mine. But it was, everybody knew, even though it was called Bureau of Land Management land, everybody knew that that was the place where the people of Picary's Pueblo had for many hundreds of years gotten their clay for their pots. Now it's really important to realize that the Picary's Pueblo only has 300 people. But they had the obligatory hearing. You know, the Canadian company had to have the obligatory public hearing, ho-hum, and let's get on with it. And the Picary's Pueblo sent their war chiefs over in full regalia. And they stood up and they said, if you dig this copper mine, we are going to war with you. So about 3 months of silence went by. And then there was a small thing in the paper that said that the company had decided to go elsewhere. So, you know, I mean, even though according to the rules of the World Trade Organization, the mining company had the upper hand, and they had all their papers in order, and all of international law was for them. And yet, it took, you know, like 3 or 4 guys with feathers standing up to actually make a change with that. So it's kind of interesting. So the last mammoth task that we have, that's a really big job. The last mammoth task that we have is the recreation of a new/ancient world. And again, I want to say, this fair is what that's all about. The farmer's market. Elect Lucille. The 2 places I've been so far since I've been here have been yards where people are dedicated to having the whatever grow back, and so that we can forage, and so challenging the weed ordinance. is part of that creating of a different world and making that the world that we live in. So I'd like to finish with a story from the Haudenosaunee, which is a story about what kind of world we want to live in and that we are living in. And in this story, all the creatures of the world gather together in a council. And the purpose of the council is to remember what each creature is a specialty in and does, and the interactions and the interconnections that exist. And so one by one they come forward. And the beaver says, well, my job is to look after the wetlands, and my job is to monitor the stream flows. And the worm comes and says, well, my job is to burrow into the soil so that nutrients and air can get down there so that plants may grow. But there's this one creature that's way off in the corner and is kind of confused and is scared and doesn't quite know what it's there for. And everybody else says, well, you must know. I mean, it's so obvious. Your job is to glory in it all and to praise creation. And so we must remember this as we proceed in our healing of ourselves and of our society, and our remembrance of who we are, and in our political resistance work, and also in our creating of a new world. We must remember that our job on this planet is to praise creation. So, thank you.